to have with us Nancy Arbuthnot and Tom Gannon. This is going to be a very special evening. It, Ann Becker facilitated one of our recent evenings, and she said she so much looks forward to these nights where she gets to gather with her tribe. I was thinking, I have 3 tribes that are keeping me whole since the election. And I feel in Tom's work and in Nancy's work such a beautiful moral sensibility that it feels like all of my 3 tribes are coming together. Uh, I go to church at All Souls Unitarian, and I have my mindfulness practice group, and I have the poets. And I toggle among the 3 in order to not lose my balance and to get through the daily disappointments that the news seems to be meting out. I'm even taking a course called Spiritual Grounding for Dangerous Times. And this course has been a source of many wonderful things, including readings. And I've noticed that the readings are often poetry. How about that? We're not surprised, right? I'd like to share with you, before we get started, a poem that was circulated to our group. It's a poem by John O'Donohue. You may know it, A Blessing for a Friend on the Arrival of Illness. But I'm not going to talk about the arrival of illness. I'm going to just talk about these days. So forgive me that one little tweak. A blessing for a friend on the arrival of tough times. Now is the time of dark invitation beyond a frontier that you did not expect. Abruptly, your old life seems distant. You barely noticed how each day opened a path through fields never questioned, yet expected deep down to hold treasure. Now your time on earth becomes full of threat. Before your eyes, your future shrinks. You live absorbed in the day to day, so continuous with everything around you that you could forget you were separate. Now these dark days have come between you. Distances have opened in your eyes. You feel that against your will, a stranger has married your heart. Nothing before has made you feel so isolated and lost. When the reverberations of shock subside in you, may grace come to restore you to balance. May it shape a new space in your heart to embrace these times as a teacher who has come to open your life to new worlds. May you find in yourself a courageous hospitality toward what is difficult, painful, and unknown. May you use these days as a lantern to illuminate the new qualities that will emerge in you. May the fragile harvesting of this slow light help you to release whatever has become false in you. May you trust this light to clear a path through all the fog of old unease and anxiety until you feel arising within you a tranquility profound enough to call the storm to stillness. May you find the wisdom to listen to these days. Ask why they came, why it chose your friendship, where it wants to take you, what it wants you to know, what quality of space it wants to create in you, what you need to learn to become more fully yourself, that your presence may shine in the world. May you keep faith with your body, learning to see it as a holy sanctuary which can bring this night wound gradually toward the healing and freedom of dawn. May you be granted the courage and vision to work through passivity and self-pity to see the beauty you can harvest from the riches of this dark invitation. May you learn to receive these days graciously and promise to learn swiftly that it may leave you newborn, willing to dedicate your time to birth. Thank you, John O'Donohue. And what a great tribute to our poets tonight, that I know I can read anything and still you will be amazed by the quality of the work to follow. I'm really pleased to introduce Nancy Arbuthnot. I've known Nancy a long time. She was a pretty gosh darn amazing literary critic back in the day. And I'm just so much appreciating her poetry, having a chance to spend some time with it this week. It seems to me that in Nancy's poetry, there's no such thing as a spiritual life apart from our moment to moment experience of life. She gives us a life in all its fullness, with gunshot and violence and threats of violence, with cherry blossom petals and blood red hearts on the umbrella of a streetwalker. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you also for giving us Washington, D.C., the dome of the Capitol, just beyond the parking lot of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. That's my Washington, and this is Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Beth, and thank you all for coming here. And thanks to Takoma Park, and probably somewhere in their funding, they've got the National Endowment in there. And so I want to shout out to them. And as I heard about the cuts today, I remembered a book that I had done on the Crow Indian Reservation 30 some years ago through a grant from the Montana State Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. So I wanted to read a poem that we did together, a group poem of the third graders, called On the Banks of the Bighorn. The road leads to the river. We climb down the cliffs to the bank, then get our feet wet in the shallow water. We throw in our line and it whizzes through the air. An eagle swoops down and steals our fish, a rainbow. The sun's good air makes us sleepy, and we dream about flying and about walking on the sun. And sort of in the same vein, I have a couple of poems from a book that I wrote years ago and was published in 2004 on the animal sculptures of Washington, called Wild Washington. And lion is from, it's not this lion, there are lots of lions in Washington. This is a lion at the zoo and on the Taft bridges. But there's another lion on the steps of the Corcoran, or two lions there. And they're wonderful, sort of sleepy lions, resting with their head in their paws. How lazily the lions lie, heads on paws, flanking the entrance to the Beaux-Arts Museum. Across the ellipse, a glimpse of the White House. Inside these great halls, the peace of heart that comes with meditating on art. So when your hearts get too rambunctious, go visit some art galleries and maybe you can calm down. And just another one, a kind of silly one, for yaks, which don't exist in Washington except with too many people who talk, but there are no sculptures of yaks. shaggy majesty of hair and horns and high humped back. The wild yak wanders Tibet's cold plateaus, its long, low grunt resounding far, unanswered here in Washington, which lacks yaks. But there are, as Mary Beth said, lots of other things in Washington. My husband was a policeman for a long time, and one of my first experiences with him was going on a ride along, and in the third district at the time, and that it was not at all what it's like now. And exploring the red light district there as I rode in his car Mangia and kind of slouched down in the seat so no one would see me. Red light district. Let me show you my beat, he said on our first date, opening the door of his gold car Mangia, leaning over me to roll down the window and let in the sweet Washington spring. Cherry blossom petals settled on the windshield as we wound along Rock Creek and up the circle on Mass. General Thomas, astride his steed, plumed hat in hand, peered resolutely into the night. In rain just beginning to fall, under a pink umbrella rimmed with red hearts, a streetwalker sidled close. Seeing me, her face shut down, a shade pulled against the light. As she spun off, umbrella whirling, the hearts blurred into a blood-red loop, cinching us tight together forever, deep in the city's heart. More recently, I've been exploring art, my own painting, and I've written my poems on top of my art pieces as a way for, first of all, more people to read them. So, as a few of my paintings have been in exhibitions, I've marveled at people standing in front of poetry and reading it. They don't come to poetry readings, but some of them go to art exhibits and they look at what's in front of them. So, I will read one of those from my book Spirit Hovering. This was published a couple years ago now, and I wrote the poems, or at least the book started. It was about 5 or 6 years in the making, but it started when I went off to a writer's residency, an artist residency program in Virginia, and it was so quiet there. It was out in near Amherst, Virginia, on an old farm. They had built a new residence hall, but they gave us studios where we could go out to the corn crib or various other outbuildings and write or do art in those spaces, and then come back and be or have our lunch delivered to our door, and then come back in the evening and have this wonderful supper ready for us, and then enforced quiet hours after 8 o'clock and until 9 o'clock in the morning, when they served us breakfast, and the wonderful smells of cinnamon rolls and other really rather heavy things would come wafting up and would get you up and get you ready for the day. So I finished my project, which was a translation of Vietnamese poems. I don't know Vietnamese, although I've tried to learn it. I've taken a class at GW, but everyone else spoke Vietnamese already, so it was a little hard for me. But I have a friend who's Vietnamese American, has lived in the country for 30 years, and now that she's free of taking care of children and has accommodated herself to her American homeland, she ended up writing poems in Vietnamese in very traditional old Chinese and Vietnamese forms, writing poems about her time in Vietnam and her time as a boat refugee and then her first years in America. She wrote them in Vietnamese, but she and her daughter translated them literally, and then I took them and tried to turn them into poems. So I was working on those, but I finished everything in 3 days, and I still had 7 days on my residency. So I picked up the Bible that I happened to have, um, and just would find a phrase, whatever phrase on that page jumped out at me, and I'd think about it, and I'd look out at the cows on the hillside, and I tried to connect the phrase or sometimes just a word to my life. So that painting is about going into the mountains. I love to hike in the mountains, and those are in Utah. I did that painting, and then I thought it really needs the poem on top of it, so I put my poem into the mountains, um, from a time from Luke, the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus goes up to the mountains. But it's my experience. Into the mountains, carrying only water and dried fruit, a handful of nuts, I walked without thought, the path glinting with mica. Sun warmed the boulders, the stream spoke. With every step, worry fell from my shoulders. In the high meadow, I rested, looking up into infinite space. Ants crawled my arm, tickling. I could have stayed forever among the high mountain peaks and blowing grasses. Dipping my hand in the cold, pure snowmelt, I became water. Light became all elements. And another poem was inspired by the word moth. In Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, there's a passage in which Jesus says, "Do not store up treasures, earthly treasures, because they will rust." And and there was a moth in there too. Moths will eat, your garments. So, moth. O moth that lived only a day in the cedar trunk where I store my wool sweaters. As I run my cheeks over the pink angora, the black cashmere jewel neck, as I wrap around my shoulders one last time this loose knit green sweater I love to read in the wing-backed chair, while outside a red-headed woodpecker knocked at the maple. O nibbling moth, nothing of yourself remains but absence. And Maui sundress. Let's see. Now I can't remember what the phrase was that got me started on this poem, but something about, again, about loss and not paying attention to losing things of the world. From a box in the attic, my daughter unfolds a gift to me from my mother, the flowered sundress from Hawaii. Fuchsia bougainvillea spills down her hips, purple hibiscus dances as Annie twirls and the colors blur into a blue sea. Oh, what an emptiness when she left for college, her room a mess, gifts still tissue wrapped in a bottom drawer, pearl necklace curled in its box, lavender sweater set, and rumpled on the closet floor, the Maui sundress so lightly worn. I don't know why I never wore that sundress myself, but I kept it for 25 years, and then I thrust it into my daughter's hands and said, "Here, you wear this." And she did once, I think. And a poem. I have one poem for each of my children here. So that was to Annie. This one's to Charles. And I guess I'll read the one for my older daughter, Margaret, too. Charles gets driving practice. The dawn wind is bone chilly, and we have a whole day before dusk and the drive back to DC. But inside the car parked on Riverside Drive, we're warm with the 5 hours Charles has driven through the November dark to log the night hours needed for his license. At 7, we breakfast on cold croissants and coffee across from Union Seminary, a comic strip on the restroom wall assuring Linus, on his second brownie, that God is watching. At 8 o'clock, we take a leisurely tour of Barnard until it's late enough, mid morning, for Charles to visit his friend at Columbia and for me to walk across the park to the Museum of the City, exhibiting the famous New Yorker map of the United States, land between coasts, reduced to thin heartland and a mountain range. And a display of life in the 50s, Roy Rogers bedspreads, 10 howdy doody lunch pails, a watercolor of boys jumping naked in the Hudson. Outside on a sunny bench, I lunch on tuna fish, then head back across the park to meet Charles, fresh from the history of war. Afternoon still before us, the entire city ours. But we're not up to braving Broadway or climbing the Empire State Building. We did that when he was 6. Or taking the ferry to the Statue of Liberty, or looking at Ground Zero. And it's too cold to loiter on the steps of the old library and watch students pass. Too cold, even nestled against the steps, wind blocked, in full sun. We could just sit in the Toyota and listen to Hamlet on my iPad, Charles proposes. So we settle in, facing Grant's tomb with its view through barren branches of the GW Bridge. Tell me, are you honest? Were you sent for? We're startled awake by Hamlet's urgent plea. Streetlights flickering on, Charles starts the car. I'm glad that I didn't simply sign the form as I was tempted, claiming that my 19-year-old son had driven the required night hours, but rode with him through Maryland, across the Susquehanna, the river Coleridge wanted to live beside because he loved the name, and the state of Delaware, the oil refineries along the Jersey Pike, and over this bridge into this city where we spent a day and had an honest time of it. And then I will finish up with Traveling Light for my daughter Margaret. From Matthew, Gospel of Matthew again, my burden is easy, you can travel light, let me take your burden. So, goodbye, cousins, Lighthouse and Eddie. Goodbye, apple tree in the meadow. Station wagon packed, boxes of books and suitcases stacked in the back, duffel bags stashed in a corner, blueberry jelly jars jammed in spare places, kids squished in the middle. Down Bay Point Road, our car hums. Suddenly, a scream from behind, slamming to the roadside, whirling, we find our teenage daughter's shoulder, a snout-nosed gray vole. Little hitchhiker, not once but twice more we break, pull out boxes, suitcases, duffel bags, jars, and only at your third appearance at Margaret's ear do we catch and toss you out the window, glad to be rid of you at last. Or so we thought. How quick, bright-eyed you appear in our stories, though at the end terrified but hopeful, legs spread-eagled in imitation of wings, believing that it is possible to travel light. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Nancy. That was really wonderful. Uh, I realize I didn't actually say who I am, and this is something that I inevitably fail to mention. My name's Mary Beth Haydem. It's a great privilege and an honor to be on the Third Thursday Poetry Advisory Committee with such wonderful people as our current poet laureate, Meryl Leffler, our past poet laureate, Ann Becker, both of whom unable to be here tonight, and also Meredith Pond and Martin Fitzpatrick, who has done a wonderful job of hosting this series for years and years. We're very fortunate to have tremendous support from the city. Sarah Danes our housing and urban community director, and Marilyn Sklar, who helps support the arts programs. These people are both poets. How about that? Aren't we lucky? And what an amazing thing to find poets in Takoma Park. So here we are. Thank you, Takoma Park, and thank you. I should thank also our wonderful technical support people that are making it possible for us to be YouTube stars and TV stars if you go to the City of Takoma Park TV web presence. So I'll point you there. Uh, let's see. Have I done all my business? There's a. I would like to point out that there is a sign up sheet outside of this door, and that what that would entitle you to is announcements on all of the wonderful events that we have here in Takoma Park in the community center, many of which are free. For instance, on the current program, you can see we have music coming up, we have lectures coming up. And I should mention also that the third Thursday of April will be here, and we'll have three more poets, and I threaten to be among them. It'll be Laura Bobreau, Sarah DeCarla Souza, and yours truly, Mary Beth Hatem. Now I've said my name twice, so that's a record. I'd like to mention one other event that's one of my favorite Takoma Park happenings, and that's Favorite Poem Night, uh, April 18th. This is the night where you get to bring some published poem that you have read and admired, and you share it with the Takoma Park community. This is really one of my favorite events because I tell you, we got a lot of poetry lovers in Takoma Park, way beyond the folks who come to our readings. And it's really fun to see the teachers and the engineers and the physicians and the nurses and every kind of profession you can imagine, every age you can imagine, and the great joy and excitement with which they share their very favorite poems. So that's April 18th, 7:30. It's an event that you can find more information on the Takoma Park Library website. It's really a very fun evening. Next, and most important of all, I'm going to introduce you to Tom Gannon. Tom, I'm so jealous of the title of Tom's book, Food for a Journey. It's so simple, but also so wonderful, as is the book. T- uh, Tom gives us poems from all different times in his life, and they manage to be completely memorable no matter what part of his life it is, whether it's growing up in Philadelphia, whether it's doing pastoral care, musing on politics, saddened by war. Tom gives us some unforgettable characters, and I'm looking forward to hearing him read from his book, Food for a Journey. Thank you.
Well, hello, and thank you for coming. Um, thanks, Mary Beth, for the introduction, and thanks to Marilyn and to Sarah who set this thing up. And it's a great honor and privilege to be here and to be able to share these few poems with you. And as Mary Beth said, there's a lot of my personal history in these things, and I'm going to start with one called Cloistered Life, which really goes back to when I was a student in elementary school in South Philadelphia. But it was, there are an awful lot of Italian American families in the neighborhood. I went to school with many youngsters who were Italian American, and this poem comes from that experience. called Cloistered Life. Every Italian household had one, or so it seemed, to her grandson's classmates at least. An older woman, small, bent, wizened, gray hair pulled back into a bun, clad all in black, a filmy tunic over a long dress that an Italian noblewoman might have worn a century before. She hovered in the semi-darkness beyond the living room when the guests arrived, soon to retreat into the kitchen, where her spiced tomato gravy, her people did not call it sauce, simmered on the stove. Smiling warily, timidly, the smile not quite natural, not so much forced as produced because expected, mute in the presence of visitors because she had no English and they had no Italian. Far removed from bomb-wrecked Naples and its twisting, garbage-strewn lanes, or a hardscrabble farm in the bleak Calabrian hills, or a tiny flat among Palermo's swaggering gangsters, she had been brought over after the war and the collapse of Il Duce's imperial fantasy, brought over to join her children, the venturesome ones who had already established themselves in the New World, in William Penn's fair city on the west bank of the Delaware. It was a cloistered life, to be sure, enclosed by lack of language, cooking and cleaning for children and grandchildren. But the work was not a burden. She had always worked before the voyage to America, from the time she was a little girl. Not for her to sit all day in an upholstered easy chair, dreaming, perhaps even fondly, of the life she had left behind, of those years in Naples or Calabria or Palermo. It was not a perfect life in this new and unfamiliar world of a South Philadelphia row house, but better, a life without the hunger and fear she had known for so long. Safe at last in a refuge she had not known existed, smiling so warily, so timidly, out of semi-darkness at her grandson's classmates. The next is actually grew out of a much more recent event. It was a visit to Paris a little over 3 years ago. My daughter, who is here tonight, had a friend who was being married in the Basque country, and before we went to the Basque country for the wedding, my wife and I stopped in Paris for a week. And I think it was our first morning there, we took a walk from our hotel and we passed this church. This is called Visiting Saint-Sulpice. At Saint-Sulpice, Church of Mismatched Towers, a memorial mass had just ended. The mourners clustered in small groups on the broad, sunlit plaza in front of the church, near the monumental fountain of the four bishops. The plaza bordered by tree-lined sidewalks, elegant shops, crowded cafes. To enter the church is to move from daylight to semi-darkness, where the air is alive with organ music. No matter that the Mass is over, the organist continues to play. His mammoth instrument, with its 5 keyboards, the grandest in Europe. Beyond the entrance, flanking the center aisle, 2 enormous half clamshells, outsized gifts from a fabled city on the Adriatic, serving now as fonts for holy water. Off to the right, the Chapel of the Holy Angels. Delacroix worked here, painting 2 giant murals, scenes from Genesis and 2nd Maccabees. Jacob grappling with one angel, 2 others driving the Heliodorus from Jerusalem's temple. On the floor of the nave, the famous gnomon, the one that tourists, readers of a famous novel, come to see. But the brass strip leading to the obelisk catching rays of sunlight, tells only of solstices and equinoxes, not of priories of Zion. On either side of the nave, beneath the soaring, many-vaulted ceiling, a museum's worth of statuary in front of the supporting columns. Behind the main altar, the Lady Chapel, the floodlit statue of Madonna and Child, aglow in pink marble. Beyond the columns on both sides, broad aisles lead past side chapels, a dozen or more, named after long-dead saints. Some fronted by banks of flickering candles, evidence of lingering devotion in the church's eldest daughter, even as the tide of secularism continues its inexorable advance. At length, a side chapel so dimly lit it is easily overlooked. Morte pour la France. The inscription on a wall says, and on gray stone panel after gray stone panel, beneath and beside it, as the chapel's other walls wrap around the altar, columns of names descend. Men of the parish, hundreds of them, who died for France in the war to end all wars. Behind the names of necessity, hundreds of families, spouses, children, parents, left in desolation as industrial scale warfare on the Marne, the Meuse, the Somme, in the Artois and at Verdun, on the Chemin des Dames, turned the Luxembourg quarter into a vast plain of mourning. The panels echo other names, those inscribed on the mass graves that lie to the east, dotting the French and Belgian countrysides from the North Sea to Switzerland, the Western Front, where the butchery took place. The panels served, too, as mute witness to the exhaustion that left the nation too war-weary to resist when the Germans marched again. Visitors depart, and the murals and clamshells, the statuary, and the gnomon, they fade from memory, but the panels, the long columns of names remain, a somber reminder that there is more to this church and its history, more to France and its history, more to life itself than Fodor's tells the tourist. The next poem is somewhat recent too. The setting is a basketball game downtown at the Verizon Center, a college basketball game, but the poem's not really about the basketball game. It's called Tribute. A Monday night in February, the Verizon Center, 3/4 full. Notre Dame is in town, but the Fighting Irish have left their game in northern Indiana. Georgetown's Hoyas, long, lean, limber, take them to school. Midway through the second half, the margin reaches 20. Hundreds begin the trek upwards, from their seats to the exit portals. A pass sails out of bounds, and a whistle blows. From the scorer's table, a signal to the referees, a commercial imperative, a television timeout. As the teams withdraw to the benches, a line of people emerges from an aisle near the Georgetown student section, files onto the court, mostly young men, a few young women. The men, it turns out, are wounded veterans from America's 21st century wars. The women escort the most grievously hurt. No athletes there, so many of them maimed, missing an arm, a leg, even both legs. They hobble on crutches, propel wheelchairs. Their artificial limbs, silvery tubes, suitable for Star Wars robots, gleam in the bright arena lights. Some of the men are unmaimed, but their frozen faces suggest deep injuries within. to the brain, to the soul, hidden wounds that lead to depression and addiction and suicide. The public address announcer directs the crowd's attention to the file of veterans and their escorts, now arranged in a ragged line at mid-court. He identifies the veterans, names the conflicts in which they received their wounds. Noble abstractions, those names, floating in the ether above the sand and the heat and the makeshift bombs. They are honored guests of Georgetown, the announcer says. He requests a round of applause in recognition of their service and their sacrifice. He makes no reference to the armchair Napoleons, the think tank field marshals, who sent the young man on the court to places they would call the sandbox and the stand, where the earth erupted beneath them in truly great balls of fire and pillars of oily smoke, splintering bone and shredding flesh. The dwindling crowd rises dutifully to its feet, begins to applaud. The veterans and escorts, curiously vulnerable, stand at mid-court as the applause washes over them. After 10 seconds or so, the applause begins to fade, dies out. It has been polite, not too long, not too loud. Roars following pretty Georgetown baskets have been louder. For a while, the veterans and escorts linger at mid-court, as if waiting for something else. But there is nothing else. At length, they realize the tribute is over. They turn and straggle off the court, retracing the route they took when entering, enveloped by anticlimax. As the last of the file clears the court, a horn sounds. The players leave their sideline huddles. The Georgetown cheerleaders begin a new set of acrobatics. Georgetown's bulldog mascot mangles a shoebox labeled Notre Dame. Another signal from the scorer's table. The commercials have ended, for a while at least. The referees blow their whistles. Play may now resume. And then the final poem I'd like to read is comes out of a period, 2 weeks, a long time ago, actually back in August of 1970. But at the time I was a recently ordained priest, and I'm the novice priest in this poem. Excuse me. It's called Food for a Journey. It's the title poem of the book. The priest is a beginner at this thing, this business of being a priest. He has been ordained for less than 3 months. He helps to edit a magazine, deals with words, sentences, paragraphs, with people, not so much. He needs experience with people, experiences as a priest working with people. An opportunity arises, 2 weeks in a hospital, a substitute for one of 2 chaplains. The novice priest volunteers, takes up the duties of the man he replaces, dividing responsibility for the patient's floors with the chaplain who remains. The novice priest finds there are things he can do: offer Mass, give communion to the bedridden, hear confessions, not many of those, pray with those who want to be prayed with. Some do not want his ministrations. They make that very clear. He skips their rooms as he makes his rounds. He finds there are some things he cannot do. He does not have the words to console a single mother who has lost her 4-year-old son, the center of her life, to a wasting disease. In his inadequacy, the novice priest offers his presence. Perhaps that is something. The woman knows no other priests. She asks him to offer her son's funeral mass. He does that readily. Perhaps that is something too. Neither can he find the words to comfort a young woman raped by a pretended friend days after she arrives in the city. Again, in his inadequacy, the novice priest offers his presence. Perhaps that is something. In an emergency room corridor, detectives confer with the doctor who will examine the victim for evidence of the crime. The novice priest wonders if the moral theologians would approve of a D&C. Patients come and go. One comes and stays in a private room on the floor the nurses call the Gold Coast. He is the most famous football coach in America. He has colon cancer and he is very ill. The novice priest does not see him. The other chaplain has responsibility for the 5th floor, but he sees the coach's players when they come to visit. Huge men filling hospital corridors with their bulk, black, white, whatever. Packer, green, and gold, the only colors that mattered. They leave the hospital shaken. The man who led them, whose will drove them to championships, is in decline. The coach's employer visits with them. He is the most famous trial lawyer in America, defender of Joe McCarthy, Frank Costello, and Jimmy Hoffa. But he cannot defend the coach from the cancer. It is Sunday night. The other chaplain is away. The novice priest has responsibility for the entire hospital. He makes his evening rounds, and this time the coach is on his list for communion. It is not surprising. When he was well, the coach went to Mass, received communion every day. The novice priest approaches the coach's room, knocks with some trepidation. His contact with legends has been limited. The coach's wife comes to the door. She shakes her head. The coach is having a blood transfusion. He cannot receive communion. The novice priest moves on to the next floor. He is still there when a nurse appears. She has an urgent summons. "Father," she says, "you have to come back to the coach's room. When he found out that his wife had sent you away, he hit the roof." The roof hitting is easily imagined. All those televised sideline eruptions at his own erring players, at hapless referees. The novice priest assures the nurse he will return. Outside the coach's room, his wife slumps on a bench, chastened. Inside, the room is fragrant, flower-filled, so many flowers from so many people. The coach is sitting up in bed. He may be wasted by illness, but he still projects an immense personal force. He speaks to the novice priest in the rasping voice that millions would recognize. "We had some trouble, Father, but we got that straightened out." The novice priest takes a host from his pyx, the gold leaf-lined vessel in which the chaplains bring communion to patients. The host is not large, a thin, dry, tasteless wafer of unleavened bread, the size of a quarter. But when the coach sees it, he waves it off. He has trouble swallowing. For him, the host is too large. The novice priest breaks off a piece, a sliver of unleavened bread, a quarter of an inch wide, small enough for the coach to receive and swallow. Food for the next stage of his journey, one that will not end at a 50-yard line. The novice priest places the fragment on the coach's tongue. A glass of water helps him to swallow it. He thanks the novice priest, who gives the coach's blessing and departs in a daze. The novice priest's 2 weeks of experience as a priest working with people, come to an end. He returns to his magazine, to words and sentences and paragraphs. A few days later, the next stage of the coach's journey begins. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Nancy, for this beautiful celebration of language and truth telling. What a refreshing and wonderful evening. I will leave you now with just a few words from not a famous poet, but a famous writer, George Saunders. George Saunders has written a poem called Trompe l'oeil. Would you like to hear it? Do people know it? I don't. Okay, so here it is. I think we should laugh. Would you like to laugh? I feel the need to laugh. So instead of reading you just the inspiring last little lines, I'll give you a taste of favorite poem night and have the unbelievable pleasure of pretending I'm George Saunders. Wow. Okay, so he writes Trompe l'oeil. A fragile egomaniac has taken up the reins, obsessed with size, defensive, and unmoved by others' pains. He seems to think that saying A while B is clearly true will cause the truth of B to wane and make A true to you. He stomps his foot, and with his hand he does that little chopper, then calls all things amazing and tells another whopper. What is it that he wants so much? What wound must he assuage with all these lies and posturing and all that pent-up rage? When all is said and done, it seems the thing he wants is more. Enough to finally satisfy some raging inner war. Everything's unfair to him, so sad, so overrated. Whatever gifts the world can give, insulting and belated. If some of you who voted for this vain and flailing man are noting now some meanness in his attitude and plan, it's fine, it's great, we welcome you. Please come on back and aid us in switching off the Kellyannes who nightly serenade us with tricky sliding caveats and puzzling odd denials, with scary twisted Orwell riffs and sunny prom queen smiles. In other times and places, this dopey gong has sounded to claim that truth's negotiable and that we're all surrounded by enemies, by horror and by hate, by refugees who want us dead and liberals sleeping late. But what if in the end, my friends, what seems most true is true? The president is like himself and not like me and you. A famous guy for all these years, an ego in a bubble, who learned that great attention could be got by causing trouble, and craving said attention, scuttled out in its pursuit, the working man's defender in a fine Brioni suit. Speak up, rise up, correct and shout, be stubborn and satirical, resist, rebuff, demand the truth, be positive and lyrical. Your country needs you now for sure. Your country needs your power. It needs you like a fragile thing in some uncertain hour. For goodness, peace, and decency were never heaven sent, and each of us must now become our own alt president. Thank you so much for the wonderful power and the fragile thing that we were tonight. Thank you for coming.